We are here today with Steve Blank. Steve, you are a serial entrepreneur turned educator. You developed the customer development methodology that changed the way startups are built. Your book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, launched the lean startup movement. You teach entrepreneurship at Stanford University, UC Berkeley, and Columbia. And your recent book, Startup Owner's Manual, is your latest addition to the Entrepreneurial Practitioner's Library. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thanks for having me.
My first question is, what is customer development and what are the main principles of customer development?
That's a great question because I ask myself that a lot. Customer development is really a simple observation, is that there are no facts inside the building. And we didn't really have a methodology for getting outside. And so it's a 4-step process to do search and then execution.
So you mentioned there are no facts inside the building. What does it mean to get out of the building?
Well, I come from a Silicon Valley background of technology startups. And when you have a bunch of technologists in the room, on day one, you have a series of essentially faith-based hypotheses that if you build it, they will come. And we've now run this experiment for the last 40 or 50 years in Silicon Valley, and I kind of observed is most of the time they don't come. That we're having a great time building the technology because we believed it was the best thing ever, and that the only thing we need is an extra room to put the bags of money. We kept failing because we'd run out of money, and we'd almost always run out of money, not because the product failed. If you think about that, that's kind of interesting. Silicon Valley, we were taking more technical risks per square foot than anywhere else in the world, but it was almost never that the product just failed to perform. Don't get me wrong, I've never seen a product ship on time with all its features, but it was actually after it did ship, our expectations of who the customers were and why they bought it just never kind of matched, and we always ended up firing executives to solve the problem. We always would say, well, they didn't make the plan. Never quite asking, well, where the heck did the plan come from, and why is this the VP of sales problem rather than a more fundamental problem? And we just never had the language or even the structure and the strategy to describe that perhaps we were making a mistake. And the biggest mistake we were making was thinking that startups were smaller versions of large companies. And all we had to do is replicate what large companies did in writing business plans and building organizations without understanding that we needed a very different strategy. Because large companies execute known business models, startups search for them. We had no way to even describe this search process.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Many entrepreneurs are very confident that they know what people need and that they know which problems are important to solve. UX researchers believe they have no idea what people need and therefore they wish to find out. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, this is a real interesting dichotomy because founders, not engineers in startups, but founders, regardless of their past, no longer are researchers or engineers or MBAs. The day you become a founder, actually you become closer to an artist than anybody else. What you're really doing is you have a vision and you want to reach that goal. You want to gather a group and get the resources and execute towards that vision. So a startup is a faith-based organization. On day one, it's driven by vision. Most of the time, though, that vision turns out to be hallucination, and the consequences are pretty easy to understand. You run out of money and you shut down the company. And so the whole thing about customer development and lean is that we now insert a process to turn those faith-based hypotheses into facts. The user design and user experience groups are not trying to execute to a vision. They're actually trying to answer a series of questions. And those are very different. I mean, well, they might have went to the same schools and actually have the same backgrounds, and you stand them next to each other, they look to the same people, look like the same people. They're actually quite different. Founders see something that you don't. They see something that most of the time doesn't exist, but they're heading to that. You're trying to rationally answer a series of questions as researchers. That's as night and day as we could get.
So I really can't.
What do you think of that?
I think there's definitely truth in that. We are different people. We are always trying to answer questions. Sometimes founders and business people and even engineers challenge us.
Yeah.
And
They don't want the data, right?
yeah, yeah.
Because
And
it creates cognitive dissonance. The problem with, this is another interesting point, is, one of the problems, and here's another part for your book. It's a key element about customer development. And this is for you. I'm talking to you. One of the key things about customer development I learned is, and I made this mistake personally, if it's my vision and my hypothesis, this is what's right, this is the right user, this is the right, here's how they behave, etc. And I hire a VP of sales, or in your case, I hire a researcher who goes out and finds out Steve. It's absolutely not who they are. What do you think my first instinct in replying is? What do you think I say?
I have my opinion.
Not only do I have my opinion, you're wrong. You're just not explaining it right. Go back out. And if it's a VP of sales, he goes back out, blah, 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 gets more data, and comes back and says, Steve, the baby's ugly. No one likes it. You have a natural reaction. You're fired. You just don't get it. Or if you're a researcher, I'm just going to ignore your data. You're never going to change that. Well, and this is the mistake both researchers and sales VPs make. What we need to do, and what I do in customer development, is I don't let you hire anybody. This is why your book is critical. I make you go out, and you need to talk to those customers first before you are allowed to hire a single salesperson. Because there is no way, if this is your vision, you are going to be able to hear from a second party that you are wrong. We're talking now about human nature, not about data. And this is what confuses researchers, is they think if they present logical facts that are irrefutable, then obviously people have to listen to it. And somehow they're continually surprised over their careers that how come people aren't listening to my irrefutable facts, not understanding that these decisions are not being made on the basis of irrefutable facts. That's not how human beings are wired. It might be how researchers are wired. It's not how people start companies are wired. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I'll drop my questions. So if you rarely see a researcher in a startup company.
Right.
I mean, I never heard
They're
of
toxic.
I never heard of one.
So, big idea. Researchers are toxic. Research is essential. Right? And that's the distinction. And what you want to do, and we were having this conversation, what you want to do is teach entrepreneurs how to do the 80% that don't require 20 years of research experience. And you also want to teach them what's the 20% they do need to hire experts or outsiders. And in fact, this is the failure of the research community, is not to understand that, listen, this isn't about how smart you are. It's how smart we can make the founders, or how smart in a large corporation can we make your management, and then how do we teach them that, and for this additional stuff, the ethnographic studies or whatever, that's what we do, and we know how to do it well, but you've taught them to appreciate the other 80%. And that's just the failure of the profession, with all due respect, not a failure of an individual's intelligence. And this is why customer development works. Because customer development says, listen, I know you're not a salesperson, you're just some dumb founder. I want to teach you how to talk to customers, because unless you get that data on day one, you're not going to believe anything, and you're just going to go down a path based on complete faith until you run out of money and never understand why. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Now I'm going to get back to my questions.
I think this is really important to your profession. Is understanding that I'm not advocating putting you guys out of business and letting the secret sauce out, but if you hold it all like this, then you're going to be incredibly frustrated that you've not been able to connect to the people who actually need your stuff, because you haven't taught them how to do it themselves. And by the way, it's hard to do that because the first thing they'll start getting is data that contradicts their faith.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Someone I interviewed said that she is a usability consultant, and she said that we tend to agree to do usability testing just before launch, and then we come back with a list of defects exactly at the time where the team is looking to reduce the list of defects.
Right. So therefore, it's not like, how do we move this earlier in the testing process? It's like, maybe we have a process. The whole process is flawed. And in fact, that was the entire customer development observation. It's not like, let's do product management better. It's like, oh, no. It's the whole process is just, we're doing a process in an existing market for existing customers. Well, it's only large companies that can do that. For startups, we have no data. And then when Eric Ries observed that the agile engineering folks were actually doing a part of this, then customer development and agile engineering and agile development made natural pairs. And that was the first instance of what he called the lean startup. And that was an enormous contribution. Later on, when I integrated Alexander Osterwalder's work about thinking about a startup or even a company as nothing more than a business model. That is, Osterwalder's thesis is that any company, large or small, can be defined in 9 components. And my extension was 2. One is defining what a startup is, or a new venture in an existing company. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And now you understand what the charter is. Oh, we need to test who the customer segments are, and how do we acquire them and keep them. We need to test their revenue model. We need to test all these things, which in fact plays back to research. But now we understand that what the charter of the organization is. And now getting out of the building makes a lot more sense. It's this constant iteration between design, engineering, and customers that isn't, oh, I build it and then I launch it and then find out, after I burned a ton of capital that no one wanted it, which was the traditional methodology. This is incremental and iterative, but it engages the people who make decisions. Here, the only people outside the building early on, and by outside I mean physically and virtually, are the founders. Why? Because they're the only people capable of hearing data that conflicts with their initial vision. They're the only ones capable of iterating or pivoting the strategy. If you don't have authority to change the product or the features or the customer segment, I don't want you talking to customers early on. And that's heretical, because researchers will say, that's my job, I'm the expert. That's why researchers are relegated to corners in organizations when they shouldn't be. What they need to be doing is teaching the methodology to the people involved early on, and then having their expertise appreciated for, wow, I need more of this, or wait a minute, give me this more, or wait a minute, this needs to be built in as an integral part of our organization, because I, the founder, or I, the division GM, had to go do this on day 1, and now that I found something repeatable, I got to tell you how valuable that is as an integral part of our organization, rather than some tag on later. Make sense?
Of course. Last question.
Yes.
I relocated to the U.S. a few years ago from Israel. Israel is known for being a startup nation with about 3,000 active startups, second only to Silicon Valley. These Israeli startups are very strong on the technology side, but more often than not, less so on the UX and design sides. What do you often suggest to startups who want to be better in design?
So, my very brief stay in Israel made me understand Israeli entrepreneurs much better than just seeing them out of the context in the U.S. and more in the context of the country they live in and grew up in. And in any organization or any system that's faced with crisis does either one or two things. It collapses, or it figures out how to continually iterate and innovate. And Israeli military is probably the best example of it, but as a culture as well. And so I think the series of technical innovations that come out of Israeli startups, and I have to tell most people about Unit 8200, but others, etc., just provides huge amounts of technology innovation when faced with crisis. But I've noticed just a cultural phenomena is Israelis take customer input poorly, and in fact have an anti-culture of listening to other people's opinion. And it's really kind of a real dichotomy is that, again, on a battlefield, they'll respond to the situation, but outside of a crisis, their opinion counts for more than 1,000 customer inputs, and that just seems to be a cultural problem. And so when there was a bubble, Israeli companies tended to get acquired for the technology assets, but they, as companies, they have a real hard time being global because they don't listen well, particularly to other cultures outside of Israel, and Israel isn't the large enough market to be sustainable for anything other than in defense. And then there's still a large export business that sustains that. In fact, Israeli military hardware is probably the best example where they do listen to customers. So I don't know if this makes sense, but culture really does kind of define your ability to listen a lot. Because in the U.S., there's an interesting phenomenon, certainly in Silicon Valley and other entrepreneurial clusters, which shouldn't go unspoken, is here failure equals experience. That is, no one likes to fail, but we don't need to change our name, and we don't, we're not hugely embarrassed. I mean, we're depressed. I mean, we go through all the right stuff, but if you have coffee with your friends after you've created a company, their first question is, so what are you doing next? Rather than how embarrassed is your family, etc. And that's a unique advantage here. And by the way, it's not, it's a disadvantage in other cultures where face is really important. And it's a disadvantage in other cultures when you can't even listen to input and criticism. And so I don't know if I answered your question. But, by the way, do you think it's valid or not?
I led you there, so so it's fair.
Do you think it's valid about Israelis?
Yes, I do. Yeah. I do. And I think, cultures are changing. I hear a lot of startup founders in Israel that are very open to customer development, that are very open to learning about that, more about that. So what would you recommend to startups who are very strong on the technology side and want to be better in design?
So there's, I have found, and again, a lot of this stuff is about human nature, not about technology and process. If you haven't screwed up a startup, customer development is kind of a nice theory. Right? It's just kind of, they say you're supposed to talk to customers, and then you go, but it's really about my idea anyway. Boy, after you've failed once, you kind of get, maybe if I would have asked these people or whatever. And so I'll just make the general observation from the guy who invented the process. Listen, if you haven't done a startup before, or you're lucky enough to get it right, congratulations. And I'm not suggesting everybody should naturally get this. And if you're smart enough to figure it out, you're much smarter than I was, because it took me about startup 6 or 7 before I started realizing that it wasn't all about me, that it was actually about the people outside the building. And so I think this is more about human beings and wiring. If you kind of can get that this is a better way to make the end goal and the end outcome, probably a better outcome, then you'll adopt this process the day you start your company. And by the way, for web or mobile apps, there's probably no other way to do it because it's the most cost-efficient way to do this, or else you'd be raising tens of millions of dollars rather than starting companies on friends and family or credit cards. But for large corporations or for life sciences, in fact, money and infinite resources push away customer development because there's no penalty for failure. But it makes the process incredibly inefficient. And if I were senior management or C-level executives in large corporations, I'd be panicked that my competitors are actually using this process because they're going to make look like a blur to me in their ability to actually iterate and build new products.
So what do people like me do in corporations? Do they have hope?
Sure, but again, I'll go back to even in large corporations. These job specs of UI and research or whatever, unless I'm mistaken, God didn't write them down somewhere. Some human being constructed an organization that said, this is the most efficient way where these people fit in this bucket and they report up to these product managers or somewhere else. Personally, I think it's not the researchers or the UI designers. I think the organization is broken. And I have to tell you, the only hope is when you get the project managers or the engineers or the senior execs to actually start doing some of this themselves. And I don't mean spending 6 months outside the building, but if all an executive who's running a product does is shuffle papers and have meetings, I'd update your resume because they will never appreciate what you do. If you could get them personally on the phone or out in a couple of customer meetings and engaged in the process and actually going, oh, oh, they don't like her. Oh, all of a sudden you will not be trying to like push Jell-O uphill, because that's what's going on nowadays. Is you are some kind of like cost center or guys trying to like tell other people what they don't want to hear. No one likes that. What you want to do is engage them in their own in the process themselves.
These are all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think I think the word ergonomics and the human interface design, etc., we've been thinking about how to do this well in the last 40, 30, 20, 10 years. And of course, there are world-class companies like Google and Apple and others who actually have made a business in doing design as an integral part of their company. But I still think those are the exceptions rather than the rule. And it's worth thinking about how did they integrate it into the DNA of their company rather than make it, departments or just cost centers. And I think that's the real learning. At the same time we're pushing on what do we know about human beings and how to get better design, I think we're also learning about organizationally how to articulate this as a strategy rather than talk about the structure first. And we'll get better at this. So there is hope for everybody else out there. And I really appreciate you asking me.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.